Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to our new episode. You're listening to Enthusiastical History and our episode 1.1, which is technically our third episode, but we don't talk about that, named Kings and Kingdoms. In our previous episode, we've told the story of Hengist and Horsa in the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the settlers, people who arrived there like Cerdic, Hengist, Horsa, Ella, and Ida, and so on. And those are strange names, and we've also mentioned a few strange terms. That is strange for the average reader who doesn't have much information regarding the era. So this episode is for clarifying a few things before we keep going. Like, what were these kingdoms and how did they come to be, and so on. If one is to understand and comprehend the Anglo-Saxon era of Britain, he or she must firstly have an understanding, at least a basic understanding, of the late antiquity and the collapse of the Roman Empire. Rome was a big empire, big, powerful. They had standing legions, thousands of men, tens of thousands of men in different parts of the world. Their empire stretched from the Hadrian Wall in northern Britain all the way to Anatolia and to Egypt. It was massive. It was a vast empire, and you know everything about Rome was really big, really vast. I mean, vast is a perfect word to describe the empire. If I were asked to describe the Roman Empire in one word, I would say vast, because everything about them was vast. Their lands were vast, and their population, and the armies, and the buildings they've done, and it was great. And then, it was a long process. Of course, it didn't happen at first, but over time, the empire started collapsing, and this collapse changed a lot in Europe. Now, we're not going to talk about other parts of Europe, and we'll just stick to Britain. So, uh, what happened in Britain is that the problem with Britain was that the Romans would appoint a governor to Britain, and that governor would be given a lot of troops because Britain was a huge island, and there were many barbarians as Romans saw them, like Picts and Scots and Britons who refused Roman rule and were residing in the western parts of the island, and then there were Saxon and Frisian raiders and Frankish raiders. So the governor had to be given a big army to defend the island. It sounds good on paper, right? You appoint a capable commander and give him a decent amount of soldiers, and you tell him to defend the island from barbarians, and keep the peace, keep the order, collect taxes, send them back to Rome. It's awesome, couldn't be better. Well, the problem is, human beings tend to be ambitious, and so these men during times of crisis, like when there was a succession crisis after the emperor's death, or even when the emperor was alive but not seen as legitimate or perhaps as weak, thought to themselves, well, I'm a capable commander, I have lots of legions under my command, why don't I march on Rome and become an emperor myself? And they often did, or at least tried. To name a few, there were Crassus, Magnus Maximus, Marcus, Gratian, and some of these men, to be exact, two of these men weren't even governors. They were just soldiers from the army. They were common soldiery, but they were proclaimed as emperors in Britain by the army, and then they marched on Rome. I mean, imagine yourself in the foot of a proclaimed emperor, would be emperor in Britain. Say you are Magnus Maximus. You've just declared your intentions of usurping the throne. What do you do next? Well, you can't just, stay there. You have to go to Rome and take the throne. But although you have, lots of men, so does the other guy. So you have to take every single able man who would follow you to Rome in order to succeed, in order to, increase your chances of success. So people like Maximus stripped the island of all of its soldiers and therefore its defenses, because fortresses without men don't really work now, do they? And they marched on Rome, and some of them were successful, others were not. But our focus is on Britain again. So what happened to Britain was that once the soldiers were gone with the governor, they were left defenseless, and these people were mostly disarmed by the Romans because Romans were there to provide protection against the barbarians. The Britons didn't need any weapons now, did they? No, they'll just give their taxes, be good civilians, and Romans will protect them. But with the Romans left, they'll be left defenseless. And so, that was the case. It happened several times. Governors left, they either died or became emperors, and then new governors were appointed, and soldiers came back, and so on and so forth, until a man, a common Roman soldier named Constantine, who was declared emperor in Britannia in 407. And then he left. He left for Gaul, and he went on to become and rule as co-emperor. Not for long though, but he managed to do what he wanted to do. I mean, it was a great success for the guy. Imagine you're just a common soldier, and then a year later, you're just an emperor. But what about Britain? Well, after the departure of Constantine III, nobody else was appointed in his place. So, thus, Britain was given its independence. And that's how, the Romans left Britain. Now, that is also, why Vortigern had to look for another ally, because he appealed to Flavius Aetius, the Romans, but he was declined because they couldn't really help. They got their hands full, as we've mentioned in our first episode. Anyhow, that is the story of the end of Roman rule in Britain, very briefly, but I think you get the point. So, what about the Anglo-Saxons? Where do they come into the picture? Well, Britons ruled themselves for a while, and then they were under constant attack by Picts and Scots and Franks, Saxons with their navies. There was chaos everywhere. Warlords, Briton warlords started attacking each other to assert control, to establish their dominance over others. There were infighting and barbarians and so on. It was a horrible place, horrible time to be alive. And then the Anglo-Saxons came. Now, although the story of Hengist and Horsa is a good one, as I've said in our introduction episode, it's probably not real. And the first settlers, the first Anglo-Saxon settlers, actually arrived in sometime around 430. That is what the archaeological evidence says. So these guys arrived, but the difference between reality and the story of Hengist and Horsa is that these first settlers, they didn't follow kings or lords as we thought they did. They were actually freedmen. They came as settlers. They settled in the areas of the Britannia, and obviously there must have been fighting, but there probably weren't any kings because the archaeological evidence, doesn't show any signs of a elite class being there. It seems like there were no elite at all. The first settlements had halls, houses in relatively similar sizes, and the burials were similar to, no one was that above, others. So, if they weren't present at first, how did these kings and lords come to be? Well, the elite signs we've mentioned and that we said are absent. start to appear towards the second half of the 6th century, which coincides with an event with a catastrophe that probably led to all this. I'm talking about the volcanic winter of 536. There are lots of accounts from different cultures, such as the Irish annals, Chinese annals, and Byzantine accounts of this disaster. We don't actually know which volcano it was, but it was a volcanic eruption which covered the sky and started a winter, a whole year of winter with no sun almost. Consequently, there were crop failures and there were famine pretty much everywhere. And worse yet, 5 years after the volcanic eruption, a bubonic plague known as Justinianic plague started spreading from Constantinople. We don't have contemporary accounts of these events affecting Britain, but they must have affected Britain as much as anywhere else because they were, these were present in Ireland, and if there were famine in Ireland, there would be famine in Britain. They're really close. So here's the situation: the western part of the empire fell. It brought destruction everywhere as it fell, and a few decades later, when things were probably starting to get a little bit in line, the society was reforming and all that, another disaster struck, perhaps a greater one. As if there weren't enough chaos already, now there were famine and plague. You do remember the pandemic, right? 2019, 2020, and how we were all talking about that was the worst time to be alive in because we couldn't go out for merely a few months, and there was a risk of catching a virus which was not that deadly and could be somewhat treated, and for which a vaccine was found in about a year. Now imagine living in this era. I mean, it must have been horrific. Say that you were born in sometime around 500. Yeah, say 500. You were born in 500. So you're growing up and there's chaos. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and you listen to stories of a great massive empire which built great things, and if you grow up, marry someone, make your own family, start your own family, and you have a small farmhouse, a few fields. Life isn't that bad, right? And then the famine comes. All of a sudden, the sun you can't see the sun anymore. It's dark during day. Where they should be daylight. It's dark, and your crops fail. And you must be thinking to yourself, oh, what have I done to offend the gods? And then the plague comes as if it wasn't, worse enough already. And you basically fucked up. And so, under these circumstances, we believe that kingship, or at least lordship, the concept of lords in Anglo-Saxon Britain started forming because the word lord comes from the Old English word Hlafort, which means bread maker or loaf giver. So these men, like the one I ask you to assume that they were yourself, you know, they didn't have anything and get enough food. Their family members would get sick, and then there'll be a lot of violence because whenever there's famine, whenever there's plague, whenever there's chaos, political, instability, there comes violence because people start taking the matters to their own hands, which is a big problem. So you needed protection. First of all, not protection, forget about protection. You needed someone to feed you because you couldn't do it yourself anymore. You needed someone to help you. You'll be so grateful to anyone if they will merely offer you a loaf of bread to save you, at least for that day. You needed a chlaford. So, under these circumstances, the lordship began developing. There were lords emerging probably everywhere, all around the island. And these men, the stronger of them, the ones who've managed to bully other lords into doing their bidding, became kings and their lands kingdoms. Now, when we hear the word kingdom, the things that come to our minds are big, impressive, fancy castles made out of stone, and then knights who fight for the kingdom and for the king. And when we say king, we think about a man with a crown in his head and a sword in his belt, a mighty king. But the Anglo-Saxon kings just weren't that. They were love lords, they were lawgivers. After all, they weren't kings as we, perceive the word. They were love lords. The idea of a king that we have in our minds, comes from the late medieval ages, and there are centuries to come before that. Matter of fact, to give you an example, the Anglo-Saxon kings didn't even wear crowns. They wore helmets, royal helmets, and the first king to be crowned in Anglo-Saxon Britain was Athelstan, which happened in the 10th century. So you get an idea of how things were, right? So these Hlaf lords were more similar to mafia bosses than kings, the image of kings, that is, in our minds. This is how the system worked. You are a free man, a girl, you are working your farmland, you have a family, you're the head of your family, all is well, and you have a lord. You pay him homage, you give him, some sort of tax in usually food, because there weren't much coins in usage back then, which is another point that we will come into. And in exchange, they protect you from other lords who, quite interestingly, also happens to want to, have you pay homage and give some tribute. Yeah, it's a funny business, but that's how it worked. These kingdoms were more racketeering than kingdoms, if you are to be honest. These lords, they competed between each other, and like, as we said earlier, the one who managed to bully others would emerge as the greater one, the lords. And this is a process which started the first kingdoms, or the emergence of first kingdoms, those petty kingdoms like Sussex, Essex, and Lindsey, Mercia, and so on. Yeah, and now I think is a good time to explain the word Bretwalda. So Bede uses this, and he lists 7 men who ruled, who were Bretwalda, and there are a few others who deserves the title, but weren't mentioned by Bede as Bretwalders because they were Mercians, and Bede didn't really like Mercians. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Firstly, what was even a Bretwalda? Well, the word means the Emperor of Britain, which none of these men in this list were, and none will be until really, really late history. So essentially, being a Bretwalda meant that you could command the loyalty of your fellow kings. That is, they would, come to your battles whenever you called them. They would pay you tribute. They would pay you homage. And it was a good life. It was a good position to be in. You would enjoy being the High King until you were brutally murdered in battle by another king. And therefore left your position of Bretwalde to someone else, in most cases to your murderer. I think that I've made a good job at explaining what a king was and what a Bretwalde, essentially a high king, was. But you might be saying to yourselves, okay, these were kings, that's how they were. But how did the system work? I mean, to start with, how did they tax people? What was the process? Well, let's start with the tax problem. And yes, it was a problem, roots of which, again, lie in the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, a feature of the empire's collapse, which is not often mentioned compared to migration and battles and corruption and so on and so forth, is inflation. There was a problem of inflation towards the end of the empire, and we're not going to go into detail on this. You can find much better podcasts to tell you about the collapse of the Roman Empire because I'm not that well educated on the matter. However, what you should know is that the Roman coin was devalued, and it was necessarily so because minting a coin is a hard work. It's a long process. You need the materials and you need the know-how. You need experts on the issue and so on and so forth. So what the Romans opted to do instead was that they would just you know clip a little bit of their old coins and then they would melt those clipped parts to make new coins because they would just clip a little bit. No one would notice, right? Well, wrong. People notice, and you know, most of the problems the empire faced actually comes down to this because, like those soldiers in Britain who just proclaimed one of themselves for as emperor and revolted against the empire, didn't do it because they were maniacs. They did it because they thought they were being cheated. They were being taken as fools by the emperor because their pay, although the same amount in coins, was now reduced in value. So, in the 5th and 6th centuries, there were a lot of coins in circulation, coins that varied greatly in value, in size. There were coins from as far as Arabia, there were Roman coins from different, eras, different types of emperors. And yeah, it was a mess. It was a bloody mess. Well, uh, to make the situation, a little bit more understandable, I will give you an example from a much later age, from the Viking age. When the Vikings arrived in Britain, when they were raiding, as they were raiding a place, they would take literally everything made out of metal. They would take the cooking pot from your kitchen because it too could be used as money. They would just break it up and get the parts and weigh them and pay the traders with that because coins weren't being minted anymore. Well, I lied, they were being minted, but not in large quantities. There were several kings who minted their own coins, such as Ethelbert of Kent, and then there's also Mercia and Charlemagne and so on. But these coins were, rather symbolical, and they weren't really being minted for common usage. And right now we're talking about a time before these mentioned kings. So, there were no coins being minted in Britain. So, a common man, a Saxon farmer, wouldn't have any coins. So, it would be unfair to demand coins from this guy as tax because, well, he just didn't have them. He couldn't have given them. So, what did the lords do? They traveled throughout their realm over the year, staying in places for, sometimes say, a lord would visit a village and he would stay there for say 2 days, and then from there he would go to another village and spend 2 more days there, and then he would arrive at his city, one of his cities, and he would stay like 2 weeks there, and from there he would go to a, another city, and during his stay, the Lord would expect his subjects to pay him tribute and also feed him and his retinue, his courtiers. And that is how the early kings of Anglo-Saxons, taxed their subjects. But the whole business of traveling wasn't just for taxation. The king would also see to the matters. He would act as a judge. He would listen to complaints, fix problems, see repairs done, and blah blah blah. So yeah, the kings were mobile. The kings didn't really. They had royal residence, but they didn't have a designated place. They were very much mobile. And now you might be wondering, well, how did those villages and cities and all those relatively small settlements manage to feed a king and his followers? Well, the answer is simple. The king didn't have that many followers. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, the world quite literally shrunk in size. Remember how I defined the Roman Empire in one word: vast. Well, everything the Romans made was massive, from buildings to empires, everything that you can think of. And that wasn't the case following the collapse of the empire, because the Roman Empire had access to all kinds of resources that you would need for big projects, while these petty kingdoms, these small time gangster like law of lords, just didn't have those means, so they had to be more modest in their works. Now I'm going to quote from a book which is called That of Kings. It's the sixth book of the Saxon stories, a novel series, a historical fiction series written by Bernard Cornwell, who himself is a Anglo-Saxon historian. And what I'm going to quote is the thoughts of Uhtred, the main character. And for those of you who are not familiar with the book, he's an Anglo-Saxon warlord, and that's all you need to know about him. So I quote: "I love to build, yet I look at what the Romans did, and know we cannot construct anything half so beautiful. We build sturdy halls of oak, we make stone walls, we bring masons from Francia who raise churches or feast halls with crude pillars of ill-dressed stone. Yet the Romans built like gods. All across Britain their houses, bridges, halls, and temples still stand, and they were made hundreds of years ago. Their roofs have fallen and the plaster is flaked, but still they stand, and I wonder how people who were able to make such marvels could have been defeated. The Christians tell us we move inexorably towards better times, towards their God's kingdom on earth, but my gods only promise the chaos of the world's ending. And a man only has to look around him to see that everything is crumbling, decaying, proof that the chaos is coming. We are not climbing Jacob's ladder to some heavenly perfection, but stumbling downhill towards Ragnarok." Although a fictional character, Uhtred summarizes the situation perfectly. Yes, the Romans were gone, but their works were still there. Armies used Roman roads and they used Roman bridges to cross rivers. Talking of bridges, Uhtred says, quote, "I sometimes think that if the Romans had never invaded Britain, we would never have managed to cross a river." Which is funny, but it's true. So the shadow of Romans was still there, and it would keep haunting people throughout history. Buildings weren't the only thing that shrunk in size. Armies did too. Roman Republic and later Roman Empire was able to field tens of thousands of legionaries at any given time. To give you an idea, let's talk about Battle of Pharsalus for a minute. There was a battle happened in 48 BC between Gaius Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. And in this battle, Caesar was heavily outnumbered. And can you guess how many men he had with him? 23,000 men. And the enemy had about twice the size of that army. So in total, there were close to 100,000 men fielded in Macedonia in just a single battle. Now, to give you a better idea, I'm going to mention another battle, Battle of Brunanburh, that took place in 937, and it was a big battle. You know, it included almost every single ruler, every single powerful man in Britain during that time, and it was such a big deal. Decades later, people refer to this battle simply as the Great Battle. And do you know how many men they had? Well, modern estimates are that each side had around 8,000 to 10,000 men, so in total there were 20,000 men fielded. So just by looking at this example, you can see how things changed following the end of late antiquity. And need I remind you that this Battle of Brunanburh, this great battle, is from 10th century, and the time era that we are dealing with right now is from 5th and 6th centuries. That's where our story begins. So I hope that understand the situation better, understand how these things work and how the world changed. This was a world of people living under the shadow of Roman giants, a world of lords and kings who had quite smaller forces compared to just a few centuries back. For example, Athelfrid of Northumbria, who I've mentioned in our first episode, the first guy who united Northumbria, who laid the foundations of that kingdom, and who was a big shot during his time, had like 300 soldiers, a war band consisting of 300 soldiers, and apparently that was enough to achieve all the feats that he achieved. And that is due to a few reasons. The first one being that population shrunk in size too. All those years of famine, plague, violence, and chaos really did an effect on population. And apart from that, there's also the obvious logistics. These people, these tribes folk, these so-called kings, they don't really have the means to field and feed large armies. So, they had to be content with what they had, small sized war bands is what they preferred. But don't underestimate their power. These men were elite warriors, raised from their childhood to be merciless butchers, so they were still very effective and very deadly. However, that is not a topic that we can go into today because this video is already long enough, much longer than I thought it would be, but I think that it's necessary, a long video is necessary to really help you understand, help you grasp the situation before we keep going, deeper into the story. So we're going to talk about the war bands and the society in general, not now, but in our next bonus episode. And that's all. Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it this far, I assure you already know a great deal more about Anglo-Saxon history and culture than your average fellow, which is not that big of an accomplishment now that I think about it. But yeah, thank you for listening. This is Enthusiastical History. Stay tuned. I'll see you in our next episode. Bye.